For a long time on this channel, we've talked about how Ukraine has several options to completely neutralize Russia's shadow fleet of tankers. And with it, the majority of Russia's oil and natural gas revenue, and with that, the main funding mechanism that Russia uses to fund their government and therefore also their military. And for a long time, people have told me that this wasn't possible, it was just speculation. If Ukraine could do this, they would have done it a long time ago. But now, in fact, we are seeing that Ukraine is actually enacting not just one, but two of these methods, or at least both of these methods are now being enacted. The first of these methods is the one that most people have heard of, and this is sanctions on Russian energy, which isn't actually enacted by Ukraine primarily, but rather by Ukraine's international partners like Europe and the United States, acting on behalf of Ukraine. Everybody's heard of this. If people get punished for purchasing Russian oil and natural gas, they're going to be less likely to do it, and that is now happening. But another option that Ukraine has long had that far less people have talked about is kinetic sanctions. In fact, this channel might be one of the first places that we actually talked about this, where Ukraine at any time has always had the option to attack the actual terminals that load oil and natural gas onto Russia's shadow fleet tankers, thereby making it impossible for Russia to load the ships in the first place, thereby making it impossible for Russia to actually sell their energy. I have always thought that at least one of these things would take place. I never in my wildest imaginations thought that both of them would happen, let alone that they would both happen at exactly the same time. But that is now what we're seeing when it comes to Russia and their ability to generate oil revenues, and it's been absolutely devastating for Russia already, and it's just getting started. So let's talk about both of these things, why they potentially haven't happened yet, why they're happening now, and what it could possibly mean for Russia's ability to continue funding their war for the long term. And let's start with the one that less people have heard of, which is Ukraine now attacking the terminals that actually load the shadow fleet tankers. This move is something that makes a lot of sense from a strategic perspective if you just think about what it's actually doing. When it comes to Russia generating their revenues, oil and natural gas don't just teleport from one location to the next. If Russia wants to sell their oil and natural gas, for example, to China or to India, they need to actually have a mechanism to deliver that. And there's really only two major mechanisms that can be used, at least at the scales that we're talking about, to support an entire economy. And those two mechanisms are pipelines and oil tankers. Russia could also use trucks and rail, but those are really not ideal for these kinds of volumes. They're more ideal for more last mile type transport or more in between regional type transport. And so if you want to stop Russia's ability to sell oil and natural gas, the best thing to do is to interrupt one or both of these methods. It turns out that there's only so many pipelines to China in the first place. India is far too far to have pipelines from Siberia or Russia in general. And so the main way that Russia can actually sell their oil and natural gas is their oil tankers. It seems obvious, but it's important to point that out. Oil tankers, though, don't just get magically loaded. You don't just magically take energy from Siberia, from oil or natural gas fields, and teleport that into an oil tanker either. In order to get to an oil tanker, that energy first has to travel through, you guessed it, pipelines, and then once it reaches the end of those pipelines, it actually has to be pumped onto the tankers. Again, it seems obvious, but it's worth spelling it out. Because when you spell it out like that, you realize that there is a critical point of weakness in this entire chain, which is these terminals where the pipelines end and the oil tankers start, where you actually have to have some kind of mechanism, some kind of machinery to make that happen. Again, it doesn't just magically happen. Now, I realize I've been saying oil tankers for both oil and natural gas. That's not what I meant. They're separate ships, but you get the picture. It's essentially the same concept. And in either case, because of this entire setup, it means that in Russia's entire energy infrastructure, there are these single critical points of weakness. You don't have to disrupt the whole thing, and Ukraine has actually been very successful at disrupting a whole lot of the whole thing. All you have to do is take out these critical points of weakness, both in the Baltic Sea and in the Black Sea, and you have effectively wiped out the vast majority of Russia's ability to generate revenue. And it turns out that that is exactly what Ukraine has been doing, and they are now ramping that up as we speak, literally the day that I'm recording this. The first signs that Ukraine was actually going to actively pursue this strategy, and it was no longer just speculation, came back in September, where around the same time that Ukraine really was ramping up their strikes on Russian energy infrastructure as a whole, really starting to hit a lot of Russian oil refineries with abandon and also double tapping different oil refineries, showing that they were trying to take those offline. Around the same time, in all of this context, Ukraine struck the terminals in the Baltic Sea in and around the area of St. Petersburg that actually loaded up the Shadow Fleet. And while those terminals were offline, it was costing Russia tens of millions of dollars of revenue, US dollars of revenue per day. As tankers were sitting around, they couldn't get loaded. And not only were tankers not able to get loaded at that time, but every day that the system sat offline, those tankers were now incurring costs, but they weren't able to operate. And it was building up a queue because even once you fix the thing, it takes a while to load a tanker. And so the problem just doesn't just get resolved immediately. It actually gets worse over time. In this context, we saw kind of two different diverging strategies, and it made me kind of realize that Ukraine's strikes on Russian oil refineries weren't so much about Russia generating revenue, but rather the oil refinery strikes were more focused on Russian internal politics, because the strikes on the terminals, again in the Baltic Sea and the Black Sea, are where Ukraine could actually destroy Russia's ability to generate revenue without having to bother with all the refineries all across the country. That being said, in recent days, we have now seen Ukraine doing the same thing in the Black Sea, where Ukraine has hit, again, the same types of terminals that load the Shadow Fleet vessels. And in this case, they haven't just hit them once, but so far they've been hitting them on a repeated basis, accelerating the damage and making it worse over time. Now, these repeated strikes that actually take out a large portion of Russia's capacity to deliver oil and natural gas in a specific region all at one time, they're actually even more interesting than they appear on the surface. Because this doesn't just have an effect on Russia's ability to generate revenue in the immediate to midterm, but it actually has a psychological effect on Russia's energy buyers. What you have to realize about the energy supply chain, whether it's oil or natural gas, is that most countries don't have a whole lot of storage capacity for these things. Or if they do, that storage capacity is already maxed out. It's used as sort of a reserve. And so when countries are purchasing energy, they are really dependent on that arriving at the time that they have planned for it to arrive. They have perhaps set aside refinery capacity for that. You get the picture. It becomes very expensive and very problematic potentially when you have delays in deliveries, and it causes people to shuffle around in a panic and to have to find alternative buyers alternative sellers really quickly. And this is an effect that a lot of people aren't noticing as Ukraine is taking Russia's Shadow Fleet offline, is that it is causing Russia's buyers to lose confidence in Russia's ability to deliver. And if Russia is not a reliable partner, the benefits of purchasing from Russia start to be a lot smaller than the risks and the costs associated with that, even if they can buy Russian energy at steep discounts. And so I believe that Ukraine has kind of waited for this moment because there are now sanctions at play, which is causing countries to think more seriously about actually listening to these new sanctions. And the two things kind of go in tandem together to erode people's confidence in Russia as an international partner. And that's going to come into play in just a second. Before we talk about those sanctions, though, what we need to emphasize here is how effective Ukraine strikes have been, and the fact that Ukraine actually has the ability to continue these strikes if they want to, and that's what Ukraine has proven. They have several options to hit these terminals. They can use naval drones, and they've done that in the Black Sea. They can use long-range missiles. They can use air-based drones. And so there's a lot of options for Ukraine to continue the pressure and to continue taking these terminals offline. And I think part of the reason that they are targeting the Black Sea more thoroughly first is because they have more options to actually disrupt the Black Sea. It's a lot harder for Russia to protect that target, especially since their Black Sea fleet has been made essentially already irrelevant by Ukrainian drones. As Ukraine really starts to take the Black Sea terminal offline, traffic will eventually have to be rerouted to, the Baltic Sea, and that will create a much more visible problem. We'll see a lot more tanker backups. That'll be hard to ignore. It'll be hard for Russia to propagandize their way out of it. And also other countries that surround Russia will get more nervous about this because we've already seen, Russian shadow fleet tankers do things like cut wires, cut cables below the Baltic Sea. And as there are more Russian ships accumulating in the Baltic, it's possible that we will see more aggressive actions from the nations that are in the Baltic Sea to actually, engage in that. So it's a very good strategy for Ukraine to prove the concept that they can take out the Baltic Sea terminals, but then to focus their energy on the Black Sea because that has the best compounding effects for them. But in either case, what Ukraine has shown, especially because they've released so many new weapons, is that they can continue this pressure. And now if they choose to, they can completely take Russia's revenue-generating capabilities offline. And again, the timing of all of this has to do with some of the new sanctions that the United States has now placed on countries that continue to purchase Russian oil. We'll talk in a second about why Ukraine has waited this long to do this instead of doing it earlier. But first, we should talk about those sanctions too and their significance so you can have the full picture. So the sanctions that are coming into play, they're really coming into play within the next couple of days to the next couple of weeks here, as the United States has now threatened entities that continue to do business specifically with the Russian companies of Rosneft and Lukoil, which make up a huge bulk of Russian energy trade. And it is said if they continue to do business with these companies, the United States will punish them. They'll punish them with access to the U.S. monetary system, the banking system. You get the picture. Companies are not willing to do this because this, in the international world, is something that you absolutely need access to. And the reason that this is significant is because it is the first time that we are finally seeing actual punishment being put on countries that continue to trade with the shadow fleet. We've seen a lot of talk, for example, but talk is cheap. And in the international world where people are getting a great benefit by trading with Russia because they're able to purchase energy at steep discounts, people are not going to stop that trade just because you asked politely. They're going to stop that trade if you put an actual cost on them that is not just an angry letter, and if that cost exceeds the benefit they get from trading with Russia. It is in this context, again, that Ukraine is ramping up these strikes, because now people are making a decision about whether they're going to continue to actually purchase Russian oil or whether they are going to risk the wrath of the United States in this matter. You get the picture. And so Ukraine is trying to shift the balance more heavily in the favor of people cutting off energy ties with Russia, because not only do they see the risks from the sanctions perspective, but there's also just the risks that Russia can't deliver. So why would you work with an unreliable partner who also could damage you in so many other ways internationally? And it's going to be obvious to most people that this is not the path to go. And Ukraine's actions at this exact moment in time are going to help a lot of people overcome some stubbornness. Now, indeed, this strategy does seem to be working. In fact, it doesn't just seem to be working. It is factually working. At least it's working with China, who, in response to all of this, has made the decision to stop purchasing from Rosneft and Lukoil. And this is a big step because, of course, China would say to Russia that they have a no-limits partnership, but apparently the limits of that partnership are secondary sanctions from the United States. I've made an entire video sussing out the implications of that because it's actually quite important. It shows what China actually does with its actions versus what China does with its words, and that, again, has a lot of implications. But long story short, when it comes to today's topic, this is obviously working. A huge portion of Russia's revenues are going to be decreasing and, in fact, have already decreased. And so with that in mind, the question that a lot of people are going to ask is, why didn't Ukraine do this sooner? Haven't Russia's oil revenues, energy revenues, been a huge drain on Ukraine? Haven't they allowed Russia to continue their military action? And if Ukraine had the ability to do this, why did they wait so long? And there's a couple of reasons, and I'll explain them both. But what I will say from the forefront is the fact that Ukraine waited proves something about Ukraine that some people still stubbornly refuse to believe, which is that Ukraine does not believe they are fighting a short war against Russia, and they never have believed that. Ukraine knows their war against Russia is going to be a long one. All of their strategies have been planned for the long term, not for the immediate term. And these long-term strategies are working. When people say they think Ukraine is losing the war, it's because they don't understand that Ukraine's goal is not to end the war tomorrow. Ukraine understands that the only way to defeat Russia is to get Russia trapped in a situation, as they have now become, where the long-term effects do damage to their economy over time and bring down the Russian military with it over time. Ukraine has always understood this, and now these strategies are all bearing fruit. And it does mean that Ukraine is probably able to last a lot longer in the war than most people give them credit for. The war is nowhere close to being over, at least from Ukraine's ability to continue fighting and to continue punishing Russia. And again, I've obviously discussed that in depth in a lot of other videos. So why did Ukraine wait so long? Why did they take the long strategy? And the short answer to that is obviously because Ukraine found more benefit in waiting than they did in immediately attacking these revenues. And that might be confusing to a lot of people, and yet obviously that's what's going on because Ukraine did have the ability to do this, and they did wait to do it. So why would it be in Ukraine's benefit to wait? A couple different reasons. First and foremost, Russia, whether we like it or not, whether Ukraine likes it or not, is one of the preeminent suppliers of oil and natural gas to the entire world. And even if you don't directly purchase energy from Russia, Russian sales of energy still affect your energy prices. It doesn't matter what country you live in because of the laws of supply and demand. If you take the Russian energy out of the market, their competitors have a lot more leverage to increase their prices, and that has an impact. So there's a couple reasons why this affects Ukraine. It affects them in a number of different ways. It affects them especially in the early days of the war, when you consider that this war started around an election season in the United States and also in Europe. And it was a hot button election when it comes to Ukraine in the United States. And the thing that people most respond to in elections in the United States, for better or for worse, is often energy prices. In fact, a lot of people say that people kind of choose their vote in the United States by going out on the morning of the election. They look at the gas price at their local gas station and they say, well, that's awfully high. I'm kind of mad at the incumbent. I don't understand anything about why this is going on, but I'm going to blame the incumbent, the current president, and I'm going to vote for the other guy. And so in some way, shape, or form, Ukraine may have thought that taking Russian energy off the market could have hurt them politically in both the US and also the European elections, which the support of the United States and Europe, for what it was worth, seemed like a bigger bargaining chip and a bigger benefit to Ukraine than the revenues that allowed Russia to continue supporting their military were a detractor to Ukraine. Obviously, Russia being able to fund its military was bad for Ukraine, but there is a cost-benefit analysis here. So that's one reason, Ukraine wanted to keep the Russian energy in the game for a little bit longer, potentially. Another reason that not a lot of people realize, which is an unfortunate reality for Ukraine, but they're smart to acknowledge reality rather than being stubborn, is that Ukraine in and of itself, especially in the earlier days of the war, was somewhat dependent on purchases of Russian energy, not directly, but indirectly, if worst case scenarios happened and Russia was able to successfully take a lot of Ukraine's own energy offline. And this is because Ukraine's lifeline, if this were to happen, is imports from Europe, either imports of electricity, if Russia managed to take offline a lot of Ukraine's own capacity, which in fact has been one of their strategies throughout the entire war. So Ukraine was wise to keep their options open here, but also in terms of gasoline for their vehicles, a large percentage of that comes from Europe, which indirectly comes from Russia because Europe purchases a lot of their energy from Russia. And if, certain countries' supplies are too low for their own needs, they're certainly not going to help Ukraine. We've seen that all throughout the war when it comes to aid to Ukraine in whatever form it comes in. And so Ukraine was wise to keep Russian energy in the picture. And for most of the war, Russian energy being in the picture, it has generated revenues for Russia, but the way it's happened has been at a steep discount, where Russia's profits have been a lot lower than most people realize. And for example, the method here was to set a price cap. It wasn't to ban the sales of Russian energy, but it was rather to set price caps, for example, on Russian oil, that were just high enough prices to keep Russia producing, but low enough so that other people got the main benefits of Russian production rather than Russia. Russia got a little bit of profits. Their energy stayed in the game. Countries like India could buy that energy. They could refine oil. They could send refined gasoline to Europe. They could send natural gas to Europe. And Europe could provide for its own needs while they were in the process of switching over to other suppliers. That was never going to be an immediate process of people switching over to other suppliers. And so the immediate strategy was, let's keep the Russian energy on the market so we have access to it, but let's lower the benefit to Russia as much as we possibly can. Now the situation has changed a little bit. The war has been going on for several years. Russia is at a point of weakness where pushing them over the edge will be worse for them. People have had a lot more time to find new suppliers, and that equation is now a little more beneficial to Ukraine. It's a little bit less risky to completely remove Russian energy from the market right now. Now, it turns out that that change in suppliers is another big part of this equation where the timing really matters. Because one country in particular is really benefiting from this change in suppliers, and that country is the United States, which has increased its liquid natural gas exports by about 25% in the past year. And that can be directly or at least indirectly attributed to people moving away from Russian purchases. Because as people move away from Russian purchases, they either buy US energy directly, US natural gas directly, or they purchase from a different supplier. But again, the laws of supply and demand, that leaves open other gaps where the United States has more market opportunities. And so in this case, the United States, and particularly people like Donald Trump, who are particularly motivated by the economy, by money, the timing in terms of election seasons and everything, it is now more beneficial for Ukraine to increase global energy prices, because now the main players are going to perceive that as actually a benefit. They're going to frame it as more profitability for American companies rather than higher energy costs for American consumers. As you can see, it all comes down to framing. You know, if you're in an election season and gas prices go higher, people blame the incumbent and they're mad at him. If you're in a season and you say, well, look, our oil and our energy companies are having record profits, people see that as a positive. It all comes down to framing, and Ukraine really understands that too. And that might be another reason that Ukraine is making these moves right now in conjunction to sanctions from the United States. And it might be another reason the United States is willing to give these sanctions. Because, again, they're not trying to always help Ukraine. We've already seen that. The United States, throughout the war in Ukraine, has been acting pretty much only in their best interests. But now their best interests are framed in the sense of it's in their best interests for Ukraine to take more Russian energy off the market. Now, obviously, different people will have their own reactions to all of that. I have my own personal reaction, but my goal here isn't to control the reactions. It's just to frame the factual basis as well as I possibly can from my perspective. But regardless of your reaction to that, the one net positive for Ukraine in all of this is that the way that everything is progressing, the fundamentals behind it, the political fundamentals behind all of this, seems to make it more likely that things are going to continue progressing in this direction. Because the United States has a lot of direct benefit to gain from this, which means that they are more likely to actually continue their sanctions against Russian energy, because that will help them out a lot, regardless of what it does for Ukraine. So it's not just them helping out Ukraine, it's them helping out themselves, which makes their support, in this case, the support of keeping the sanctions on, a lot more dependable than it would be otherwise. Ukraine has also increased its ability to carry out these strikes. There are rumors, but not confirmed at this point, that they even used a Flamingo missile to attack one of these export terminals. And if that's the case, either way, they used some kind of missile, and they really did a good job. Ukraine's ability to continue making these strikes is not going away. And that's to do with a large fact that Ukraine over time has also been whittling down Russian air defenses, Russia's ability to defend itself. Again, I have entire other videos on that too. For this one, I hope I've given all of the appropriate context though. So if you've appreciated this video, if you learned something new, I would ask that you do me a favor by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. You just watched me talk for, I don't know, probably 20 plus minutes. And if you got something of value out of that, those things are completely free and they help me out a lot. And if you really enjoy this channel, if you really got something of value out of this, also consider supporting the channel in other ways. There's a number of links in the description by which you can do so. Consider becoming a patron or a YouTube channel member. Those things obviously help me out a lot, and I'm very grateful for all of my supporters. With that in mind, there's a lot more to learn, so be sure to check out one of these videos on screen, and I'll see you on the next one.